Hey there! Welcome to the English Talk community. If you're watching this, chances are you can understand English pretty well. You can watch movies without subtitles, follow conversations, maybe even read books and articles. But when it comes to actually speaking English, that's a different story. Maybe you freeze up, struggling to find the right words. Maybe you start a sentence, but halfway through you lose confidence and stop. Or maybe you're just afraid of making mistakes, so you avoid speaking altogether. First of all, you're not alone. This happens to so many English learners, and I want you to know there's nothing wrong with you. You don't have a bad memory. You're not bad at languages. The problem isn't you, it's the way you've been learning English. And here's the good news. This is 100% fixable. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly why this happens and, more importantly, how to fix it. By the end of this video, you'll know practical, easy-to-follow techniques that will help you speak English naturally and confidently, without hesitation, without overthinking, and without fear. Sounds good? Great. Let's get started. Here's something most people don't realize. Understanding English and speaking English are two completely different skills. Just because you can understand what people are saying doesn't automatically mean you can respond easily. Think about it like this. Imagine you're learning to swim. You've read all the books, watched all the tutorials, studied every single swimming technique. You know exactly how to move your arms, how to breathe, and how to float. But the moment you actually jump into the water, it feels completely different, right? Because reading about swimming is not the same as swimming. Well, English is the same way. You've spent years studying grammar, memorizing vocabulary, and reading textbooks. That's great. That's important. But if you've never trained yourself to speak, to actually use English in real conversations, then of course it's going to feel difficult. This is why some people study English for 10 years, yet when they try to have a simple conversation, they struggle. It's not because they're bad at English. It's because they never learned how to activate their knowledge in real life. But don't worry, that's exactly what we're going to fix today. Before we talk about solutions, let's take a look at why you struggle to speak. There are 3 main reasons. You're stuck in learning mode instead of speaking mode. A lot of English learners spend too much time learning and not enough time using what they learn. They're waiting for the perfect moment when they feel 100% ready to speak. But that moment never comes. You're afraid of making mistakes. Maybe you worry about sounding silly, or that people will laugh at you. Maybe you're afraid of using the wrong grammar or forgetting words. But let me tell you something. Making mistakes is part of the learning process. You're translating in your head. If you think in your native language and then try to translate every sentence into English, it slows you down. You get stuck searching for the perfect word, and by the time you find it, the conversation has already moved on. So, how do we fix these problems? How do we go from understanding English to actually speaking it with confidence? That's exactly what we're going to talk about next. But before we move on, I want you to do something right now. Take a deep breath and say this out loud. I am learning, and I will make mistakes. That's okay. The most important thing is to start speaking. Seriously, say it out loud. The more you practice speaking, even in small ways, the faster you'll improve. All right. Now that we understand the problem, let's talk about how to fix it. In the next section, I'll introduce you to a powerful technique that will completely change the way you practice English. Are you ready? Let's go. So now that we understand the problem, why you can understand English but struggle to speak it, let's dive deeper. Why exactly is this happening? What's going on in your brain that makes speaking feel so difficult even though you already know the words? There are 3 major reasons why people struggle to speak, and once you understand them, you'll see that your struggles have nothing to do with your intelligence or talent. The good news? Each of these problems has a solution, and that's what we'll work on next. Reason number 1. You've been in learning mode for too long. Let's start with the biggest issue. You've been stuck in learning mode instead of speaking mode. Think about how most people learn English. They spend years in school memorizing vocabulary lists, filling out grammar exercises, and reading textbooks. They take tests, they pass exams, and they get good grades. But how often do they actually use English to communicate? For most people, the answer is almost never. That's because traditional English education is focused on input, learning new words, reading, listening, but not enough on output, actually speaking and using what you've learned. Here's an example. Imagine you're training to be a professional soccer player, but instead of practicing on the field, you only watch videos of other players. You analyze their moves, you study strategies, and you memorize all the rules. But you never step onto the field to actually play. Then, one day, someone throws you a soccer ball and says, "Okay, now go play." What happens? You freeze, you panic, you're not ready. Even though you know all the rules, you've never actually trained your body to apply them in a real game. And that's exactly what's happening when you try to speak English. Your brain is full of knowledge, but you haven't practiced retrieving and using that knowledge in real-time conversations. The solution? You have to switch from a passive approach, just learning, to an active approach, actually using English in real situations. We'll talk about how to do this in the next chapter, but first, let's move on to the next major reason people struggle to speak. Reason number 2, the fear of making mistakes. This is a huge one. So many learners are afraid of making mistakes. Maybe you feel embarrassed when you speak, or you worry that people will judge you. Maybe you've had a bad experience where someone corrected you in a way that made you feel insecure. Let me tell you something that will change your mindset. Mistakes don't mean you're bad at English. Mistakes mean you're learning. Think about how babies learn to speak. Do they make mistakes? Of course. They mispronounce words. They use the wrong grammar. They say things that don't make sense. But does anyone laugh at them? No. Instead, people encourage them. "Oh, you said goed instead of went. That's okay. You're learning." But when we grow up, we become afraid of looking foolish. We think, if I make a mistake, people will think I'm stupid. But the reality is, nobody cares. Native speakers don't expect you to be perfect. In fact, most of them admire people who are learning their language. And if someone does laugh at you, that's their problem, not yours. Don't let one person's opinion stop you from improving. Now, I know this is easier said than done, but I'll give you a trick that can help you overcome this fear. Start speaking in low-pressure situations first. For example, instead of waiting until you're in a serious conversation with a native speaker, start with something simple. Talk to yourself in English. Describe what you're doing while cooking, cleaning, or walking. Use voice messages. Instead of texting, send a short voice message to a friend who speaks English. Practice with AI. Use chatbots or language exchange apps where there's no pressure to be perfect. The more you expose yourself to speaking, the easier it will become. Another major reason why speaking feels so difficult is that you're translating everything in your head. This is something almost every learner struggles with at some point. When you listen to someone speak English, your brain automatically translates their words into your native language. Then, when you want to respond, you think of the sentence in your native language first, translate it into English, and only then try to say it out loud. This process takes time, and that's why you hesitate, pause, or struggle to find the right words. Imagine if you had to do this in your native language. Picture someone asking you a simple question like, "What did you have for breakfast?" But instead of answering naturally, you had to translate every word into another language before speaking. You'd slow down, your speech would feel unnatural, and by the time you finished forming the sentence, the conversation might have already moved on. The reason this happens is that your brain is still wired to think in your native language first. This is completely normal. After all, it's the language you've been using your entire life. But if you want to speak English fluently, you need to start thinking in English instead of translating. One way to train your brain for this is by using simple, everyday thoughts. Instead of saying to yourself, "I need to buy milk," in your native language, try thinking it directly in English. When you're walking down the street, describe what you see in English. It doesn't have to be perfect. Just get used to forming thoughts without translating. Another technique is using chunking, learning and practicing common phrases as whole units instead of individual words. For example, instead of memorizing the words can, I, and have separately and trying to piece them together, learn the phrase "can I have" as a single block. This way, when you need to ask for something, you won't translate. You'll just say the phrase naturally. A great way to practice this is through repetition. Take a simple sentence like, "I'll have a coffee," and say it multiple times until it feels automatic. Then, when you actually go to a cafe, The sentence will come out effortlessly, without any need to translate. Another challenge that comes with translating is overthinking. Sometimes, instead of just saying something, you might hesitate because you're trying to make the sentence perfect in your head before speaking. But real conversations don't work like that. Native speakers don't stop to analyze every single word before they talk. They just speak, even if they make small mistakes. The key is to focus on communication, not perfection. If you've ever spoken with a non-native English speaker who makes mistakes but communicates confidently, you probably still understood them. That's because fluency isn't about perfect grammar. It's about being able to express yourself naturally. The same applies to you. One of the best ways to break free from translating and overthinking is speed drills, forcing yourself to respond quickly to simple questions without giving your brain time to translate. For example, set a timer for 30 seconds and answer questions like, "What do you usually eat for lunch?" or "Describe your morning routine." The goal isn't to be perfect. It's to train your brain to think in English faster. Speaking English fluently isn't about memorizing thousands of words or knowing every grammar rule. It's about rewiring your brain to retrieve words and sentences naturally, without hesitation. Once you stop translating and start thinking directly in English, speaking will feel much easier. Many learners struggle with speaking because they simply don't get enough real-world practice. You might understand English well, you might even be able to read and write fluently, but when it comes to speaking, something just doesn't click. That's because understanding and speaking are two very different skills. Imagine learning to swim by reading books and watching videos. You might know everything about different swimming techniques, how to breathe, and how to move your arms and legs. But if you've never actually been in the water, would you be able to swim? Probably not. Speaking English is the same. You can study all the grammar and vocabulary you want, but if you never practice speaking, you won't feel comfortable when you actually need to use it. Let me tell you about Lucas, one of our community members. Lucas had been learning English for years. He could read complicated texts, watch movies without subtitles, and understand most conversations. But every time he tried to speak, he froze. He was afraid of making mistakes, afraid of embarrassing himself. He would start a sentence, but then stop because he couldn't find the right words fast enough. One day, Lucas got a job interview with an international company. It was his dream job, and the interview was in English. He prepared by writing down answers to common questions, memorizing sentences, and practicing in his head. But when the interview started, he panicked. The words didn't come out the way he had rehearsed, and the conversation didn't follow the script he had prepared. He struggled to keep up and felt frustrated afterward. So what changed for Lucas? He realized that if he wanted to improve, he had to practice speaking out loud every single day. He started small, speaking to himself in front of a mirror. Then, he joined online speaking groups where he could practice with others. At first, he was nervous, but over time, speaking became easier. A few months later, he had another job interview, and this time, he spoke with confidence and got the job. The key takeaway from Lucas's story is that you have to speak to improve speaking. It sounds obvious, but many learners avoid it. They wait until they feel ready or think they need to study more before speaking. But just like swimming, the only way to get better is by doing it. One great way to start is shadowing. This technique involves listening to a native speaker and repeating what they say as quickly as possible. You don't have to understand every word, just focus on copying their pronunciation, rhythm, and intonation. Over time, this trains your brain and mouth to produce English sounds naturally. Another technique is the 30-second speaking challenge. Choose a simple topic, like my daily routine or my favorite movie, and talk about it for 30 seconds without stopping. Don't worry about mistakes. The goal is to keep talking, even if your sentences aren't perfect. As you get more comfortable, try speaking for a minute, then 2 minutes. The more you do this, the more natural speaking will feel. Let's look at another example. Maria, a university student, had always been too shy to speak English. She was worried people would laugh at her accent or correct her mistakes. One day, she traveled abroad and found herself in a situation where she had no choice but to speak English. She was at a train station, and her ticket was missing. She had to explain the problem to the staff. At first, she panicked. But then she remembered a simple trick: Focus on key words, not perfect sentences. Instead of trying to say, "Excuse me, I seem to have lost my train ticket. Is there any way I can get a replacement?" She simply said, "Lost ticket. Need. New one." The staff understood her immediately and helped her. That moment changed everything for Maria. She realized that communication is more important than perfect grammar. After that experience, she stopped overthinking and started speaking more. She made mistakes, but she didn't let them stop her. And the more she spoke, the more confident she became. Maria's story teaches us a valuable lesson. Don't be afraid to simplify your speech. If you're struggling to form a perfect sentence, just focus on getting your point across with the words you do know. Over time, your sentences will improve naturally. Practicing speaking doesn't have to be scary. Start small, use techniques like shadowing and timed speaking, and remember that mistakes are part of the learning process. The more you speak, the more natural it will become. Now, let's dive into the next section. It's time to explore how to practice consistently and build the confidence you need to speak fluently. This section will guide you through practical strategies that will keep you motivated and help you build a routine around speaking English every day. One of the most important things you can do is create an environment where speaking is part of your daily life. Let's look at how you can incorporate speaking practice into your routine in a way that doesn't feel overwhelming. First, start small and build gradually. If you're just starting, don't feel like you have to speak for an hour every day, right away. Begin by speaking for a few minutes each day. This can be as simple as practicing some new vocabulary or reading a short text aloud. For example, a friend of mine, Emily, started with just 5 minutes a day. She'd read a passage from a book out loud or record herself speaking about her day. At first, she was nervous, but over time, she became more comfortable. Eventually, she was able to hold longer conversations and practice for 30 minutes every day, and that made a huge difference in her fluency. The key here is consistency. Even if it's just a few minutes a day, doing this every day helps to make speaking more natural. As you continue with this habit, you'll notice that the time will fly by, and you won't even think about it as a task anymore. It'll just become a part of your routine. Next, don't be afraid to make mistakes. I know that sounds like something we always hear, but it's so true. One of the best ways to practice is to embrace mistakes as part of the learning process. Think about it this way. Every time you make a mistake, you're learning something new. It's like when Sarah, the friend I mentioned earlier, first tried speaking English at a coffee shop. She was terrified of making a mistake and not sounding perfect, but once she realized that making mistakes was actually helping her improve, her mindset changed. She started practicing speaking more, and little by little, she got better. So, as you practice, don't worry about sounding perfect. Just focus on getting the words out and let the practice make you better over time. One great way to do this is by speaking with a language partner. It's less intimidating when you have someone to practice with, especially if they understand that mistakes are part of the process. If you don't have a speaking partner, there are still plenty of ways to practice on your own. Try using language exchange apps, or you can even record yourself speaking. This was something that helped Maria, another student I worked with. She would record herself speaking on different topics, listen to it, and notice where she made mistakes. This helped her improve her pronunciation and fluency, and over time, she became much more confident in her speaking ability. Another strategy is to surround yourself with English. Listen to podcasts, watch movies or TV shows, and try to repeat sentences after the characters. By doing this, you'll expose yourself to natural spoken English, and you'll learn how sentences are constructed, how words flow together, and how to use intonation. I remember one of my students, John, who loved watching TV shows in English. He would watch with subtitles, but then he would try to repeat the lines exactly as he heard them. This practice helped him build his fluency and gave him the confidence to speak in real conversations. One more technique that I've seen work wonders for many learners is to practice speaking in different situations. For example, you can simulate real-life scenarios where you might need to speak English. Think about things like ordering food at a restaurant, asking for directions, or introducing yourself at a party. These simple, everyday scenarios are great ways to practice because they force you to speak in context. When you do this, you're not just learning random phrases, you're learning how to navigate conversations in real situations. Lastly, join a speaking group or a community. Speaking with others who are also learning English can be incredibly helpful. There are online groups, local meetups, or even virtual events where learners gather to practice. The pressure is lower when everyone is in the same boat, and you can practice without feeling judged. This is exactly what helped Sarah gain confidence. She joined a group where they spoke in English for an hour every week. Over time, she grew more comfortable, and it became easier for her to engage in conversations outside the group as well. Remember, the goal isn't perfection, it's communication. The more you practice speaking, the easier it will become. So take small steps, embrace your mistakes, and surround yourself with English as much as possible. If you keep consistent with these strategies, you'll see progress and start feeling more confident with your speaking ability. Every time you push yourself to speak, no matter how small the moment, you're getting closer to the fluency you desire. It's also helpful to track your progress. You could set goals for yourself, like I will speak in English for 10 minutes every day, or I will try to use 5 new words in a conversation this week. When you reach those goals, celebrate them. This kind of progress tracking can really help motivate you and keep you on track. When you combine all of these strategies, speaking consistently, making mistakes, simulating real-life situations, and connecting with others, you'll gradually build your confidence and fluency. And don't forget, this is a journey, so be patient with yourself. Keep pushing through the challenges and you'll be amazed at how far you can go. Now, the best ways to implement these strategies is by starting gradually. You don't have to dive headfirst into a long conversation, especially if it feels intimidating. Start with short interactions. Maybe at first, you can talk to yourself. For example, describe what you're doing during the day. Something simple, like, I'm cooking breakfast now, I'm frying some eggs and making toast. It might seem like a small activity, but it makes a big difference. By doing this, you're training your brain to think directly in English and starting to lose the fear of hearing your own voice. Moreover, practice can be more fun and engaging if you find creative ways to get involved. One of my students, João, for example, loved watching movies and TV shows in English, but always just watched without speaking. One day, he had a simple idea. When the characters spoke, he would try to repeat their lines right after they said them. He didn't just repeat the lines, though, he also worked on improving his pronunciation and fluency. In the beginning, he felt insecure, but soon he realized he felt more comfortable speaking, even if the sentence wasn't said perfectly. This gave him the confidence to practice with other people. Another student, Luciana, took a similar approach, but she decided to start with simpler dialogues. She joined an online English practice group where she could chat with other learners. The first time she spoke to someone was a little challenging. She was afraid of not being understood or making too many mistakes. But instead of focusing on speaking perfectly, she focused on communicating her idea without worrying too much about the errors. And what happened? She realized that no one was paying as much attention to the mistakes as she had imagined. And, more importantly, she noticed that the more she practiced, the more natural it became. Another useful strategy is recording yourself. This could be something as simple as making a short video where you introduce yourself, talk about a topic you like, or even read an article aloud. This will help you notice areas where you need to improve, like pronunciation or fluency, and over time you'll see great progress. Don't be afraid to record yourself, even if you feel like you still need improvement. The important thing is to practice and listen to how much you've grown. I know that for many people, the fear of making mistakes can be a huge barrier. And yes, the fear of error is natural, but don't let it paralyze you. One of my students, Amanda, started with the same perfectionist mindset most of us have. She was always anxious, waiting for the perfect sentence before speaking. She told me once, I know what I want to say, but the fear of making mistakes is greater. Over time, she learned that making mistakes was part of the process. By making mistakes, she was able to correct herself and learn something new without waiting for perfection. What happened with Amanda is a clear example of what many of us go through. The fear of making mistakes holds us back, but the more she practiced, the more she realized that the mistakes were helping her improve. The key is to let go of the need to be perfect. Every time she made an error, She was actually getting closer to mastering the language. Amanda now speaks much more confidently, and the fear of making mistakes no longer controls her. This idea of gradual progress, not perfection, is crucial. With every small step you take, you'll see improvements. And when you realize you don't need to be flawless, you can focus more on enjoying the process. That's when you truly start to make progress. You don't have to be perfect to speak confidently, you just need to keep going, keep practicing, and trust that you're improving with every word you speak. The first crucial point in building your speaking skills is consistency. It's not about intense, hours-long sessions of practice. It's about making English a part of your daily life, even if it's just for a few minutes each day. Many of my students, especially those who have busy schedules, think they need hours of practice to see progress. The reality is, short but consistent practice is far more effective than sporadic, intense bursts. Take Tom, for example. When he first started, he felt overwhelmed by the idea of dedicating a lot of time to learning English, but we broke it down into small, manageable chunks. He started by setting aside just 10 minutes every morning. He would practice speaking by describing his surroundings or reading a passage out loud. Over time, these 10 minutes became a part of his routine, and he began noticing a big difference. He didn't have to dedicate hours to improve, just consistent daily practice. This approach allowed him to fit practice into his daily life without feeling like it was a burden. Similarly, Maria took a different approach. Instead of focusing only on structured practice, she integrated English into her leisure time. She would listen to podcasts or watch YouTube videos in English during her commute. Every time she did this, she was absorbing the language passively. But there was one part of her routine that made a significant difference in her speaking. She started speaking aloud to herself while listening. Even if she didn't fully understand everything, she would repeat what she could catch or try to summarize what she'd just heard. This kept her engaged, and slowly, her speaking improved because she was consistently reinforcing what she was learning. But here's the thing. Consistency doesn't mean you have to make time for English at the same moment every day. The beauty of language learning is that it's flexible. If you can only spare 10 minutes in the morning, perfect. If you have more time during your lunch break, great. There's no right or wrong time to practice. The key is making sure you're doing something every day, even if it's just a small step. Now, it's also important to incorporate variety into your practice. Don't just stick to one type of activity. Try different things to keep things interesting and to work on different aspects of speaking. For example, you can start by reading aloud, which helps with pronunciation. Then you can move on to shadowing, where you mimic what native speakers are saying in real time. You could also practice recording yourself or even talking to a friend or language partner. By mixing up your practice, you'll develop different skills, and it will prevent your practice from becoming monotonous. And the beauty of variety is that it keeps you excited about learning. When you switch between different activities, you avoid getting bored, and you engage with the language from multiple angles. This is crucial because you're learning to speak, not just to memorize vocabulary or grammar rules. Let me give you an example from one of my students, Alex. Alex had tried a variety of methods, but he was feeling stuck because he was only focusing on grammar exercises. He was an expert in theory but had difficulty speaking. I suggested he start speaking on topics he was passionate about, even if he didn't feel fully prepared. I also encouraged him to listen to podcasts and to imitate the speakers. Alex took this advice to heart. He started by listening to podcasts on technology, a field he was interested in. He would listen to the hosts and try to repeat some sentences. Eventually, he started forming his own thoughts and speaking about the topics in his own words. Alex's speaking improved quickly, and the combination of listening and speaking made a huge difference. With this approach, you avoid stagnation. By changing up the way you practice, you keep yourself motivated and allow your brain to stay engaged, which means you'll make quicker progress than if you stick to just one method. It also ensures that your skills are more well-rounded. You can't just improve your speaking by speaking. You need to listen, read, and interact with the language from all sides. This variety also allows you to practice speaking in real-world contexts. Think about it. When you're out and about, you don't know exactly what topic you'll need to speak about. Sometimes it'll be a formal situation, sometimes informal, sometimes a mixture of both. The more you practice in different ways, the more prepared you'll be for whatever situation you encounter. So the consistency we talked about is incredibly important, but it also needs to be paired with something else. Embracing mistakes. If you've been practicing speaking for a while, you might find yourself making fewer mistakes. But here's the catch. When you do make mistakes, don't let them discourage you. Mistakes are part of the learning process, and often they're signs of progress. The truth is, making mistakes while speaking means you're pushing yourself out of your comfort zone, and that's how you improve. One of the most common fears learners have is being misunderstood, and trust me, I've seen this in so many of my students. For example, Luis was terrified of speaking in front of others because he worried his accent would make it hard for people to understand him. But over time, he came to realize that people didn't care about his accent as much as he thought. What mattered more was his ability to communicate effectively. Luis started practicing in front of a mirror, speaking to himself and even recording himself to track his progress. And guess what? The more he practiced, the less he worried about being perfect. The key is understanding that communication is about being understood, not about speaking like a native speaker. Every time Luis made a mistake, he corrected it, and that made him more confident in his speaking ability. Another example comes from Laura, a student who was also afraid of making mistakes. She told me, "I want to speak, but I feel embarrassed when I make mistakes." She hesitated before speaking, and her confidence dropped every time she stumbled over a word. But I asked her to try something simple. Speak without thinking about making mistakes. I told her to let go of the need for perfection and just say whatever came to mind, even if it wasn't perfect. She took the challenge seriously, and after a few weeks, she started to speak more fluidly. As Laura began making fewer mistakes, she also noticed that she wasn't worrying about them anymore. It's crucial to shift your mindset from, "I have to be perfect," to, "I just need to communicate." This mindset shift will unlock a whole new level of confidence in your speaking. You'll start speaking more naturally without self-judgment, and you'll start enjoying the process of speaking rather than fearing it. When you embrace mistakes, you stop seeing them as failures and instead view them as opportunities to learn. And the more you learn from your mistakes, the better your speaking will become. The next important aspect of improving your speaking is exposure to real-life conversations. We often get caught up in textbooks, lessons, or even apps, and while these tools are useful, they don't always replicate the natural flow of a conversation. To truly improve your speaking, you need to engage with English in real, authentic contexts. Think about this. Have you ever listened to a conversation in English and found yourself thinking, "I understand everything they're saying, but I would have no idea how to respond"? That's a common feeling among many learners. Understanding English is one thing, but actually being able to respond in a fluid and confident way is another. This is where real-life exposure comes in. One of my students, Hannah, had been studying English for years. She was great at reading, listening, and writing, but when it came to speaking, she struggled. She would often freeze up during conversations. She knew the vocabulary, understood the grammar, but when it was her turn to speak, words just didn't come out. Hannah realized that she needed more exposure to real-world conversations, so she took action. She began by joining local meetups where people spoke English. These weren't formal lessons. They were just casual conversations with other learners and native speakers. At first, she felt nervous, but as she started interacting with others, something changed. The more she listened and responded, the more confident she became. The key was practicing in a relaxed, informal setting, where it was okay to make mistakes, and there was no pressure to be perfect. There's also the option of practicing with language exchange partners. Language exchange is a fantastic way to practice speaking with native speakers who want to learn your language. The beauty of this is that you both benefit from each other's knowledge. For example, you get to practice speaking in English, while your partner practices speaking your native language. It's a win-win situation. David, another student, took this approach. He found a language exchange partner who spoke English fluently, but wanted to practice Spanish. David would speak in English, and his partner would respond in Spanish. At first, the conversations were slow, and both made mistakes, but over time, the exchange became smoother, and David's confidence grew. He started learning more idiomatic expressions, and his vocabulary expanded rapidly. It was a relaxed, supportive way to practice without the fear of being judged. Online platforms are also great for finding language partners or even joining groups where you can speak with people from around the world. A platform like Italki or HelloTalk offers a huge variety of language partners who are more than happy to engage in conversations. These apps can connect you with someone in real time, and you can practice conversational English without leaving your home. But it's not just about talking to people, it's also about listening to them. You might be wondering, how can I improve my speaking if I'm always listening? Here's the thing. The more you listen to native speakers, the more you'll pick up on natural speech patterns, intonation, and rhythm. You'll start to notice how phrases are said in real life, how people use contractions, and how they respond to each other in natural conversations. Listening to podcasts, watching movies, or listening to interviews are great ways to get this exposure. I remember when Sarah, a student who was learning English for business purposes, started listening to podcasts related to her field. She made a habit of listening to them every day during her commute. At first, it was challenging because she didn't always understand everything. But over time, she began recognizing the key phrases and words. Eventually, she started feeling more comfortable using them in her own conversations. The beauty of this method is that it not only improves your listening skills, but it also gives you real-life examples of how people speak naturally. This is incredibly helpful when it comes to phrasing sentences, using the right vocabulary, and sounding more fluent. Now, this process of exposure also applies to various forms of media. Watching movies or TV shows in English is a fantastic way to improve your speaking. But here's the trick. Don't just watch passively. Actively engage with the content. Pause the video and repeat phrases or try to mimic the intonation and accent. You can even try to predict what the next line of dialogue will be. The more you immerse yourself in English media, the more natural it will feel to respond in the language. You see, these real-world experiences allow you to practice speaking in a less structured, more organic way. And the more exposure you have, the more you will internalize the patterns and rhythms of natural conversation. The result is that when you have to speak in real life, you'll be able to pull from those experiences and respond more confidently. It's also important to diversify your exposure. If you only watch sitcoms or listen to pop music, you're going to pick up a very specific type of English, informal, often slang-filled, and not always appropriate for formal settings. But if you expose yourself to different types of media, documentaries, news reports, TED Talks, podcasts, etc., you'll develop a more versatile vocabulary and be able to adapt to different situations. In fact, I often encourage my students to create a media diet that includes a mixture of informal and formal content. For example, watch a lighthearted TV show one day, then listen to a TED Talk the next. This mixture ensures that you get a well-rounded exposure to the language. It also helps you get accustomed to different accents and dialects, which is incredibly important as you continue to improve your speaking skills. Another way to increase your exposure is by engaging with English speakers outside of your immediate circle. Let me share the story of John, a student of mine who found himself in a situation where he had no choice but to speak English. John had been studying English for several years, but his practice was mostly limited to classroom settings and online lessons. One day, he decided to travel to an English-speaking country for a work assignment. When he arrived, he quickly realized that speaking was a lot harder than he had anticipated. At first, John felt completely out of his comfort zone. He was in meetings, talking to colleagues, and attending social gatherings where English was the primary language. He struggled to express himself clearly, even though he had no problem understanding what others were saying. The turning point came when John decided to push himself further. He started making small talk with his colleagues in casual settings, during lunch breaks, in the elevator, or while waiting for a meeting to start. It wasn't about having a formal conversation. It was just about getting used to speaking English in real-life situations. The breakthrough moment for John came one afternoon when he was chatting with a colleague about weekend plans. He had been practicing phrases like, "What do you usually do on weekends?" and "I like to go hiking in the mountains." His colleague responded with similar questions, and before he knew it, they were having a full conversation. What John realized in that moment was that his speaking wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. It was more about the flow of the conversation and connecting with the other person. This story shows the importance of embracing real-world interactions. Sometimes the best way to improve is to take those small steps outside the classroom and engage with people in everyday situations. You don't need to be fluent right away. It's about building your confidence through practice, even if it feels uncomfortable at first. The more you push yourself to speak in real settings, the more natural it will become over time. John also learned an important lesson, that speaking is a skill that develops through consistency. It's not enough to practice every now and then, and expect immediate results. Just like learning to play an instrument, you need regular, intentional practice. This is why having conversations with native speakers, whether online or in person, is so beneficial. It exposes you to the rhythm of natural speech and helps you develop that muscle memory for conversation. The idea is to make speaking English a natural part of your daily routine. Whether it's during work, social interactions, or even in moments of downtime, find opportunities to practice. You might start with easy, low-pressure situations, ordering coffee at a cafe, asking for directions, or chatting with a neighbor. These simple moments help you build your confidence in speaking. Over time, you'll be able to handle more complex conversations with greater ease. I also recommend practicing speaking out loud when you're alone. Even if you're not having a conversation with another person, you can still practice speaking aloud. For example, read books or articles out loud, narrate what you're doing throughout the day in English, or describe things you see around you. This practice will help you get used to speaking in English and develop your confidence. It's a great way to reinforce vocabulary and sentence structure, and it also helps you get more comfortable with the physical act of speaking. The more you immerse yourself in English through conversations, media, and even speaking to yourself, the better you'll become. And don't forget that making mistakes is an essential part of this journey. Each mistake is an opportunity to learn and improve. Don't let fear of making mistakes hold you back. Remember, even native speakers make mistakes, and it's the process of practicing and learning from those mistakes that will help you grow. So, how can you take these ideas and apply them in your life right now? Start by identifying where you can get more exposure to real English. Seek out conversation groups, language exchange partners, or even try out social media platforms like Instagram or YouTube, where you can follow English speakers and interact with them in the comments. Look for ways to integrate English into your daily routine in an organic way. The more exposure you get, the more confident you will feel when it's time to speak. And don't forget that real-world exposure doesn't mean that everything has to happen in person. Virtual communication is just as valuable. Platforms like Zoom or Skype offer excellent opportunities for speaking practice. You can join online, speaking clubs, participate in virtual events, or simply chat with someone across the world. These interactions, even if they are online, help you feel like you're part of a community of English speakers, and that connection will make the language feel more alive and less intimidating. As we wrap up this section, remember that the goal is not just to understand English, but to live it. Embrace every opportunity to speak, whether it's with a language partner, a friend, or even yourself. These small actions will lead to big results, and before you know it, you'll find yourself speaking English with confidence in any situation. We've covered a lot today, and I hope you're feeling more motivated than ever to break through the barriers that have been holding you back from speaking English with confidence. Let's take a moment to reflect on everything we've discussed. We started by talking about why understanding English isn't enough. It's common for many learners to feel comfortable when they listen to English, but freeze up when it's time to speak. This is a situation that many of us face. The key to overcoming this is practice, exposure, and a bit of patience with yourself. We also explored why you might be struggling, like feeling nervous or fearing mistakes, and how these challenges are actually a part of the learning process. These fears are not roadblocks, they're stepping stones. Every time you face these challenges, you're one step closer to fluency. Then, we dived into the importance of real-world practice. The most effective way to overcome the struggle is by engaging in natural conversations, whether with native speakers, language partners, or even just practicing out loud to yourself. By creating an environment where speaking becomes part of your daily routine, you'll start to notice a change in how naturally the language flows for you. We also talked about the power of techniques like shadowing, listening to native speakers, and recording yourself. These methods will help you sharpen your pronunciation and get used to how English is spoken in everyday situations. And remember, it's perfectly normal to make mistakes along the way. It's how we learn. Every mistake is a lesson. But most importantly, I want to stress the idea that the journey to speaking English confidently is a marathon, not a sprint. It's about consistent practice, putting yourself out there, and making the most of every opportunity to speak. The more you practice, the more fluent you'll become. You'll also find that the fear of speaking starts to diminish over time, replaced by confidence. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What are some situations where you've struggled to speak English? Maybe you were at a meeting, in a social situation, or trying to ask for directions while traveling? Share your experiences in the comments below. I'm sure others in the community can relate, and we can all learn from each other's stories. Remember, we're all in this together, and hearing about your experiences helps us understand that we're not alone in our struggles. And if you're feeling inspired by what we've discussed today, don't forget to subscribe to the English Talk community. This channel is all about helping you become more comfortable and confident when speaking English. You'll find plenty of resources and tips that can guide you through your learning journey, whether you're a beginner or more advanced. By subscribing, you'll stay up to date with new content that will continue to support you as you grow your language skills. So, if you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our community of learners. We're here to help each other. Let's continue to practice, grow, and, most importantly, speak with confidence. I can't wait to hear about your progress and the breakthroughs you're going to make. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.